Federal and State Affairs Committee. The chair has two. First one will be 21 RS 0539. This has been requested by the Law Enforcement Sheriff's Association, Police Officers Association. It has to do with concerning public health relating to infectious diseases. We've got a couple of hearings today. We're going to start with House Bill 2006. Matt, if you're on, would you give us an overview?
Mr. Chairman, can you hear me now?
Yeah, thank you. Go ahead. Would
Mr.
you give
Chairman?
us an overview on House Bill 2006?
Mr. Chairman, can you hear me?
We can hear you. Can you hear us?
Mr. Chairman?
Yes?
Okay, excellent. I'm sorry about that. So, House Bill 2006, the bill would amend KSA 35107 and 35205 concerning the designation of state holidays. Under current law, the second Monday in October is recognized as Columbus Day. The bill would change this day to be recognized as Indigenous Peoples Day. Additionally, under current law, the fourth Saturday in September is designated as Native American Day. The bill would eliminate that designation and keep the first Wednesday in February as Native American Legislative Day at the Capitol. And that's what the bill does. I'd be happy to try to answer questions and apologize for the technical issue.
Okay. Questions of the reviser? Seeing no questions of the reviser, we will move on. We have three proponents. First up will be Representative Dennis Boog Heiberger. Representative, you may go forward.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And with your permission, I'll speak from here.
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, thank you for allowing us to present testimony today. Those of you who were on the committee during the last term have seen this before. We had a hearing in 2019. The bill is essentially the same. The only difference is, well, when we work the bill, I will be offering an amendment to make the effective date January 1st, 2022, because, of course, calendars for this year have been printed already. Now, I first want to talk about what this bill is not about. It's not about disrespecting the cultural heritage of Italian Americans, or not about political correctness, or it's not about rewriting history, and it's certainly not meant as any disrespect to our colleague from Columbus, who's not with us today. But it's about acknowledging how our understanding of history has changed over the years, and about really just showing basic respect to our fellow citizens of Native American ancestry. So Columbus Day wasn't all, well, there were Columbus Day celebrations fairly early on in our history. I think the earliest one recorded is 1792. Italians in New York started celebrating it in 1866. Didn't really become a federal holiday until 1934. But there's a court case that I think we should all know about here. It's called Standing Bear v. Crook. It was decided in 1879, and that was the first federal court case that recognized that Native Americans were persons under federal law. So the reason, and another interesting thing about that case is the plaintiff in that case, Standing Bear, is the great-great-grandfather of our colleague, Representative Victor's. The reason I bring that up is just to point out that when we began celebrating Columbus Day in this country, Native Americans weren't considered persons or human beings under federal law. And so, given the fact that our understanding has broadened and changed over the last 150 years, I think that's a good reason for revisiting the holidays that we celebrate. I won't belabor the rest of my testimony. I would just point out, though, that since we had our hearing in 2019, 5 other states have recognized Columbus Day either through statute or gubernatorial proclamations. Those states are New Mexico, Vermont, Wisconsin, Arizona, and Virginia. And so I think it's a trend that's becoming more widespread across the country, and especially with regard to our colleague from Columbus. If this bill is passed, it would not do anything to prevent localities like cities or counties from celebrating Columbus Day, just in the same way that some cities and counties in the state, like Wichita and sometimes Lawrence, celebrate Indigenous People Day on the second Monday in October already. And so I will defer my time to my colleagues, but I'd be happy to answer questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you. If you don't mind, committee, we're going to take questions at the end of the proponent's testimony. Next up would be Representative Stephanie Byers. Good morning, and welcome to Federal and State Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, committee. Chokma. Hello, I am Representative Stephanie Byers of the 86th District. Chickasaw Saya. I am Chickasaw, and I'm fiercely proud of my tribal heritage. I speak to you today as a co-sponsor of HB 2006. As a career educator, I know that truth matters. A teacher is the expert in her classroom, and her words become facts. When my oldest son, who's now 31, when he was in first grade, his teacher approached me and said, "Can you talk to the class about the Native American perspective on Thanksgiving?" How, she added, that the Europeans brought new farming techniques and basically saved the Indians from starvation. I paused and I looked at her and I said, "Ma'am, that is not actually how that happened. That's backwards." She was close to retirement and confessed to me that she had been teaching it this way for over 30 years. And so we had quite the discussion about that. In my own childhood education, I was taught that in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. A very true statement. What was left out was that he never touched foot on the contiguous 48 states of America. He landed in the Caribbean. The closest he came was Puerto Rico, but not until 1493. What we also left out, that in the Great Columbus Exchange, where goods and services from the Americas went back to Europe and European ideas came to the United States, that what Columbus took back, in addition to crops and different types of textiles, were slaves. Thousands of Taino in the Caribbean that he captured took back to Spain to be sold. What also was left out, that when Columbus was placed as governor in Hispaniola, when those same slaves, those Taino Indians, decided to stand up against him, he had them killed, their dismembered bodies run through the streets and through the villages of Hispaniola as proof that you don't stand up against him. Those things were conveniently left out. In exchange for taking from the Americas to Europe, he left behind bubonic plague. He left behind smallpox. Matter of fact, he wasn't even the first European to come to this country. That honor was with Leif Erikson, who came here 500 years before Columbus. Yet we don't have a Leif Erikson Day. What has happened in this time is that before Columbus, we now know there were hundreds of distinct and separate nations, cultures, living and thriving in the Americas. I believe it's time that we honor those who were here before and whose descendants occupy offices within this very institution. In celebrating Indigenous Peoples Day, we join 12 other states and Washington, D.C. I thank you for your time. I ask that you approve this, and I am a proud member of the Chickasaw Nation, and thank you.
Thank you, Representative. If you'll remain for questions at some point. Last up is Christina Heswood. Good morning, and welcome to Federal and State Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Representative Christina Haswood from District 10, which is the southeast of Douglas County, going down to Baldwin City. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, thank you for your time today and the opportunity to testify today in support of HB 2006, changing Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day. I understand if this bill is a little bit uncomfortable, as I too recall in elementary school sitting in those little desks, wondering why we are celebrating this day, that we are taught to celebrate this day. Although, why should we make a holiday out of somebody who initially did not land in North America? For the past several years, we have known this history to be false and harmful to Indigenous youth who are taught in schools to celebrate this day, but then go home and are taught about our cultural history, the genocide, disease, slavery, and assimilation. My community, the city of Lawrence, where I was born and raised, first made this change to Indigenous Peoples Day in 2015 after the advocacy of the Haskell Indian Nations University students. They said this day should be made in celebration of Indigenous resiliency, survival, acknowledgement, and healing. Schools in my district, such as Billy Mills Middle School, continue to make this effort as they change their previous name to Mr. Mills's name to celebrate his accomplishments. Indigenous students at Lawrence High School have been fierce advocates to their peers, and they go out into the community to share their culture and history. I am a proud alumnus of all the schools mentioned above. I mentioned academic entities from my district because I want to highlight my personal experience and to show the communities to take this step, to show the community to take this step of healing and truth. Thank you for your time and the opportunity to testify today. I stand for questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you, Representative. This is the appropriate time. I have no other proponents that's offering any testimony. Committee, if you have questions. I'm sorry, Representative Arnberger.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question's actually for Jordan and research. I'm just curious, is it in our standards to educate about Christopher Columbus, and what is the actual standard? And you can get back with me. I ask because if depending on what the standard is, if we're teaching incorrect things to our students, and we need to make sure it's correct. So I'm not looking for an answer right now. I just want to make sure that we get that corrected and that Kansas students are educated properly.
That question was for Jordan, our research. Further questions from the committee? Yes, Representative Powell.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. This question is for Representative Heiberger. Why should this be renamed Indigenous People Day and not Native American Day?
I think that's a fair question. I think South Dakota celebrates Native American Day, and everybody else who has celebrated this holiday has chosen it to be Indigenous Peoples Day. You know, I personally, I'd be happy either way, but I would defer to my Native American colleagues about how they feel about it.
Thank you. Further questions? Yes, Representative Wagner.
I'm not sure who to address this question to, but I'm taking it from this bill that since the year 1945, the state of Kansas has had a Native American Day in September. And so I'm questioning the insufficiency of that. Why has that not satisfied the need?
And I'm going to direct that to Representative Heiberger since he mentioned it in his testimony. Would that be agreeable, Representative?
Sure.
Actually, I did. I mean, I guess I'm not sure that anybody outside this room knows that we have a Native American Day in September. I mean, again, I defer to my other colleagues on that. And again, I mean, I don't think that day has any particular meaning for the Native American citizens in my district. And again, that still doesn't change the fact that, I mean, they are aware of Columbus Day and consider it to be an insult to their cultural heritage just because of the damage that he inflicted on their culture and civilizations.
Thank you. Either the other conferees have a response to the question? Seeing, oh, yes, come up.
Thank you, committee, for your questions. I guess from my personal experience, I'm what you call an urban Native American. I'm from the Navajo Diné Nation, but grew up in Lawrence, Kansas. You know, I think Native American Day is what Representative Heiberger said, Leslie unknown. But we are taught in the school systems of Columbus Day, and it's a very harmful language. Harmful language and imagery has been connected to Native American youth's mental health decrease. I think if we really celebrate the survival of indigenous peoples and going back to the history that, this happened in South America and the Caribbeans, and that's why we, advocate for the day of Indigenous Peoples Day instead of Native American, which is often known as just in the North American area. Thank you.
Further questions from the committee? Seeing none? Yes, sorry, Representative Wagner.
Another question to the conferees. I've heard the assertion that Columbus didn't literally discover America, that he only landed, in the Caribbean or near Puerto Rico and such. My question is, historically, is that not a distinction without a difference? I mean, what literal difference does that make that he would not be considered a world, world-changing figure?
Again, I'm going to direct the question to Heiberger, and I'll allow others to chime in.
I guess that issue isn't really particularly relevant to, in my view, for why we're doing this. I mean, I think it's important to be historically accurate, but I don't think it's, the fact that he initiated a genocide that covered the entire North American, South American continent, I think is relevant.
None? Thank you. Further questions from the committee? Seeing no further questions, I will direct you to the written proponents, Hallie Vinson and Representative Ponko Wee Vickers. Is there anyone else appearing here today that would offer testimony? Seeing none, I will close the hearing on House Bill 2006. I will open the hearing on House Bill HB 2056. Matt, could you give us an overview?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. House Bill 2056 would add new sections to the Kansas Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act that would regulate the manufacture, preparation, distribution, and sales of products containing kratom. Under the bill, the Secretary of the Kansas Department of Agriculture would adopt rules and regulations establishing fees for the issuance of annual kratom dealer licenses and to administer and enforce the act. The bill would make it unlawful for any person to manufacture, sell, produce, prepare, distribute, maintain, or advertise kratom products without a license that was issued pursuant to the act. It would also be unlawful for anyone to sell kratom to anyone under the age of 18. Any unlawful sale of kratom would be a Class C misdemeanor. Under the bill, individuals would apply to the Secretary for kratom dealer licenses. For licenses that are just for the sale and distribution of kratom, the license would be approved upon submission of a complete application and payment of the fees. Any applications that were for the production, manufacture, packaging, or labeling of kratom products would be approved upon submission of a complete application, payment of the fees, and also the completion of a successful inspection by the Secretary of the premises. If the Secretary denied the issuance or renewal of any license, the Secretary would be required to give written notice to the licensee and specify the changes that were necessary for compliance with the act. The bill would also require the Secretary to inspect the premises of every licensed kratom dealer and be provided access to inspect any location or equipment used to store or transport kratom. If the Secretary was denied access to any locations, the Secretary would have the authority to apply to the court for a search warrant to inspect those premises. The bill would require the Secretary to enforce and administer the provisions of the Act and to inspect and test kratom products that were transported, sold, or offered for sale in the state of Kansas. Additionally, under the bill, the secretary would have the authority to issue a stop sale order to the owner or custodian of any kratom product that the secretary determined to be in violation of the act. The secretary could temporarily suspend the license of a kratom dealer or order the temporary closure of a kratom dealer's licensed premises without notice if the secretary determined that the public health or safety was endangered. Further, subject to the requirements of the CAPA, the secretary would also have the authority to impose a civil penalty pursuant to the act not to exceed $1,000 per violation of the act. That's a quick run through. I'd be happy to try to answer any questions the committee has.
Thank you, Matt. Questions of the reviser? Chair has one. So what this does is presently in the state of Kansas, we have Kratom. This is more of, I think it was probably best summarized last year by the Kansas Bureau of Investigation, by their testimonies, that if you have Kratom, this is a good bill because this has some regulations, but that regulation falls to the Secretary of Agriculture. Would that be correct?
That is correct.
Okay, thank you. Further questions of Matt? Seeing none, thank you. We'll move right into the proponents. First up, C.W. Mack et al., American Kratom Association by WebEx. Do we have him on?
Mr. Chairman, I'm here if you can hear me.
We can hear you. Go right ahead, sir.
Thank you so much, and thank you to you, Mr. Chairman, and to the committee for allowing the opportunity using this technology to discuss this proposed legislation. I submitted a statement for the record to highlight a couple of those points for the committee, and of course would be available for any questions you might have. The reason that this legislation is important is that under the current unregulated environment that we have with Kratom, there is a real threat to consumers from unscrupulous vendors who will spike Kratom products in order to increase their sales by adding things like fentanyl, heroin, and morphine. And it is done on a regular basis in those states that don't currently have appropriate regulations to govern it. There are, in fact, 4 states, Utah, Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada, that have enacted similar provisions to what we call the Kratom Consumer Protection Act. And we've seen dramatic reductions in the number of spiked, adulterated Kratom products in those states that are available for consumers because appropriate regulations have been enacted. I am often asked why the 15 million Kratom consumers in the United States, based on peer-reviewed published literature surveying Kratom users, about a third use Kratom just like you might use for a cup of coffee in the morning for a pick-me-up and for the increased focus. Another third use it because the alkaloids in the Kratom plant help people to relieve anxiety and smooth their moods a bit. And then a final third use it based on their knowledge and discovery of how a Kratom can help them in dealing with withdrawal symptoms from serious opioid addictions, and in some cases replace those opioids for management of acute and chronic pain. That, of course, has gotten the attention of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. It is well known that the FDA has had a very strong bias against any natural product or dietary supplements. In the case of Kratom, the FDA claims that there are adverse events and even deaths associated with Kratom use, when in fact, all of those deaths, based on the data released by the FDA under the Freedom of Information Act, shows that those adverse events and deaths were the result of polydrug use, which would not be surprising given that Kratom is an effective alternative to opioids. And so those struggling perhaps with opioid addictions or other drug addictions might be using Kratom in order to wean off of those drugs. And we have found that the deaths are associated with adulterated Kratom products, those that are spiked with these dangerous substances, all in order to enhance product sales to individuals. In 1994, the Congress had to confront the same kind of FDA overreach when in the passage of the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act, when the FDA made the very same claims, it is a pattern, that they are using against kratom, in that case against vitamins and dietary supplements. The FDA claimed at that time that in fact there were dietary supplement manufacturers producing products that were dangerous and were killing people. The appropriate solution was enacted by the US Congress in the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act. It was passed unanimously, which I know is striking given the current environment that we exist in today. And it strictly limited the regulatory authority of the FDA and provided for appropriate regulations to protect consumers. We would hope that the FDA would do that today. In 2009, there were 9 deaths that the FDA claims, based on reports, were associated with kratom consumption in Sweden. It is an issue that over a 12-month period, 9 deaths, that cluster of deaths in that short space of time appropriately caught the attention of public health officials. And in 2009 and 2016, the FDA went on a very aggressive information campaign that appropriately can be characterized today as a disinformation campaign, claiming that those 9 deaths were the justification for why states in the United States should enact bans on kratom. The FDA does not have any exclusive authority to ban such substances, and so they were attempting to get the states to do the kind of dirty work that they thought needed to be done. What they did not disclose to the 6 states that did enact over that 7-year span bans on kratom was that a group of Swedish researchers reviewed each of those deaths, and in a peer-reviewed published article that is available today called the Kronstadt study, what they found that each one of those deaths were actually caused by an adulterant that was added to that kratom product called O-desmethyltramadol, the chemical that's used in the production of very powerful opioid pain relief medications. That same dose of O-desmethyltramadol, if added to your cup of coffee or to a glass of orange juice, would kill you within minutes. And so it was the adulterant that was responsible for the death. In 2016, when the FDA determined that they were not being successful with the states, they recommended to the Drug Enforcement Administration the scheduling for kratom. And in fact, that notice was published in August 31st of 2016. What happened then was an outcry from the public, from both the public consumers of kratom, from medical professionals, from researchers, from law enforcement personnel, and from medical professionals, all of who advocated for maintaining the legal access of consumers for kratom. And in an unprecedented action, the Drug Enforcement Administration withdrew that scheduling recommendation and called upon the FDA to provide a more complete analysis of their view about the safety of kratom, which it took the FDA more than a year to do. And on October 17th of 2017, they published or submitted that recommendation. That's significant because the Drug Enforcement Administration does hold the exclusive authority to issue bans on Schedule 1 bans on any dangerous substance, particularly those that are responsible for deaths of American consumers. They act normally within, and in the case of dangerous substances, within weeks. It has been more than 3 years, and the Drug Enforcement Administration has failed to accept the FDA's recommendation. And the reason is that the FDA is wrong on the science and wrong on the policy. The National Institute on Drug Abuse, the United States Congress, and the 4 states that I mentioned earlier have all lined up in order to provide appropriate regulations and advocate for appropriate regulations. And in fact, the NIDA director, in testimony before the US Congress, which led to report language encouraging that kratom should be allowed to remain on the marketplace to help people that were struggling with these drug addictions, indicated that she believed it was inappropriate to impose a Schedule 1 recommendation on kratom. Now, people ask all the time, well, why? Why would anyone want to do this? Well, we know that the bias of the FDA against the supplements and vitamins is buttressed by pharma companies who are in the pain relief management business. And obviously, kratom will not be attractive to them to formulate a synthesized or chemically formulated kratom product as long as the natural kratom product is available to individual consumers. The Johns Hopkins University study that was published in early 2020 highlights, and you have a copy of this in the packet, highlights how important this issue is. Of those adult kratom users that were using kratom in order to relieve withdrawal symptoms, they found that 87% reported of those consumers reported they had significant relief of those withdrawal symptoms. And importantly, 35% of adult kratom users were opioid free within a year when they used it to manage their acute and chronic pain. The bottom line is the kratom can and does save lives. We advocate for consumers to have the right to make informed decisions about the consumption of kratom products, subject to appropriate regulations that will ensure that the bad actors, those kratom vendors that are unscrupulously trying to exploit the marketplace by adulterating the kratom products. With good regulations, we find that it works and it's the most effective way to protect consumers. And we ask that the Kansas Legislature would join this battle as we go forward to protect the freedom of American consumers and stop the overreach of the FDA. Thank you very much, and would stand ready for any questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you, sir. I'm going to go ahead and open this up for questions. Sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Haddo, appreciate your testimony. What are the withdrawal symptoms of the overuse of kratom?
Thank you for that question. The National Institute on Drug Abuse did two what they call gold standard animal tests that are used to determine the ability of any problem. It is true that you can become dependent, as you can on virtually any natural substance, on kratom, and typically the withdrawal is about a week, as it would be for a caffeine addiction. I'm personally addicted to Diet Coke. And the scientists report that week would be, you would experience perhaps a minor headache, a runny nose, and an upset stomach. That is vastly different than you would experience with an opioid withdrawal, which sometimes takes many months or years in order to relieve from those symptoms. But the two studies that were done showed that there was no significant addiction liability, and that's a critical factor in the evaluation of any scheduling recommendation. And those studies, which I'm glad to provide to you, which were published by the National Institute on Drug Abuse, also showed that the test animals saw a significant reduction in their cravings for the reference drug, which in this case was morphine, which accounts for why so many kratom consumers that are struggling with opioid addictions find kratom to be an effective alternative. But there's a difference between dependency and addiction withdrawal.
Go ahead.
Sir, doesn't the kratom affect the user by attaching to the opioid receptors? Just a yes or no?
Partially, yes.
Partially, yes.
Yeah, it's called a partial
To
agonist.
the opioid receptors.
As does cheese and many other substances. Yes, it does not travel to the respiratory system, which is what a classic opioid would do in binding to the opioid receptors.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Representative Heiberger?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. With your permission, I have a revisor question.
Yes. You're on the line.
I am.
Matt, have we seen an earlier version of this bill, or is this brand new?
I can answer that.
Yes.
This committee passed this bill out last year,
Okay.
and it never got above. It was scheduled to be on above the line, and of course, as you remember, we all went home early.
And that's my memory too, and it did include.
So this committee passed it out unanimous. I think it was unanimous. I'll have Connie check that.
And it included the regulation by the Department of Agriculture or not?
It did. I believe. When I have the Department of Agriculture come up, they can testify. But Representative Eppley, you.
Yes, sir, Mr. Chair, thank you. My memory is that there was regulations from the Department of Ag in that bill.
That was my.
And it's my recollection they opposed it at that time also. Is that correct?
Again, I'll wait for the Department of Agriculture to come up.
Well, then may I follow up with one question to the conferee?
You may.
Mr. Haddo, my memory is that regulation by the Department of Ag was opposed by them the last time we heard this bill, and they're opposed to it now. Have you had any discussions with them in the meantime about whether they're the appropriate body to regulate this?
I personally have not. I believe that our representatives there have, but I would tell you that the Utah Department of Agriculture has published regulations and it is now being implemented, has been implemented in the state of Utah, and they found it to be a very effective and smooth transition to regulating kratom products. And we'd be glad to work with the Kansas Department of Agriculture to connect the Utah Department of Agriculture folks with them.
Representative
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question is, you had mentioned there was about maybe approximately 15 million consumers of kratom in the United States. Where is this kratom being produced? Is it imported or is it being produced domestically?
About 95% of the kratom supplies that come into raw materials that come into the United States to be used for finished product production come from Indonesia. Virtually all kratom raw materials come from Southeast Asia because of the unique climate and soil conditions where kratom is grown. There is no reasonable growth region in the United States presently. They're trying it in Florida. That may be successful. We explored it with Hawaii, and they said it's too cold in Hawaii, which was strange, but apparently the fact. So right now, it all comes from Southeast Asia.
Mr. Chairman, I have a follow-up question to that.
Go ahead.
Are there any tariffs or duties placed upon kratom upon entry into the United States?
No, there's an import alert which the FDA has imposed, which, by the way, we fully support on contaminated kratom products on Salmonella, E. coli, and heavy metal. Normal kinds of exchanges that are done on imports like that.
Thank you. Representative Epley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Hadow, thanks for appearing in this format. I had a couple of questions from a medical standpoint as it relates to toxicity data. I didn't hear anything about that and didn't know if we had any quantifiable amount of known toxicity levels on that. And also, do we know the LD50 on this? And finally, can we do drug testing when patients come in with overdoses, if that's one of the substances they may have ingested?
On the last question, yes, there is a drug test that can show the presence of the alkaloids of kratom, metrogenine, and 7-hydroxymetrogenine. That's very helpful to determine whether they're using an adulterated kratom product that would increase or synthesize the alkaloid content, which could make kratom dangerous. In the natural form, we think God got it right. It's safe as ingested. With respect to studies that have been done about the safety of kratom, the National Institute on Drug Abuse has undergone about $15 million in studies. The preliminary results of the studies have been published to date show that kratom is safe when consumed responsibly. There obviously nothing safe if you use it irresponsibly. And in the way that it is intended for use, it is a safe product. There is no LD50 study that has been conducted yet. There have been studies that have been peer-reviewed and published that relate to the safety of kratom, both as an alternative to opioids, because that's a concern if you trade one thing for a bad one. A published study by Jack Henningfield, one of the leading researchers in this field, and I'll be glad to provide this for you, shows that you have a 1,000 times or greater chance of overdosing on an opioid than you do with kratom. Other peer-reviewed studies, articles that look at the effects of kratom if you take too much of it, and the result is an upset stomach and regurgitating of the kratom product, but you don't have any neurological or pharmacologic effects that would be dangerous to the individual that's ingesting the kratom product. There is a study that will be published in the next month which documents the NIDA conclusion is that even at 40 times the amount of kratom that an individual would be expected to consume, that it's safe. And we think that the next study is going to dramatically increase that number to show how safe it is. And we're using the FDA protocol for that they require safety.
Follow-up question. So, in the absence of polypharmacy, which you spoke to, Mac, and I'm just curious, for our discussion today, it's easy to say this has an extremely wide therapeutic window based upon your testimony, correct?
I think that's a fair assessment, yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And then I'll have one other question, and then I cut the questions off. We still have other conferees. Go ahead, Representative.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question is, Kratom as a product, I actually had never heard of it before. What are the total sales nationwide on a retail basis? How has that changed over the last 10 years? And is this sold like in health food stores, or do pharmacists sell this? How does this work?
There's no nationally projectable study that shows the actual number of Kratom consumers. We represent the consumers, not the vendors, based on survey data that we have circulated to both the growers in Indonesia to determine the export levels. The export of Kratom raw materials to the United States has dramatically increased from 2016, when the FDA first started its disinformation campaign on Kratom, to today has gone from about 400 metric tons each month to now about 4,500 metric tons. So the demand for Kratom has increased dramatically, perhaps as a perverse outcome of the FDA's campaign against it. It is sold because of the FDA's campaign against it. It is not sold yet in like Walmart's or something, in their pharmacy section or in their healthy food section. It was sold at GNC prior to the FDA's scheduling attempt in 2016. It is sold in health food stores, in convenience stores. It's sold on the internet, which is a vulnerability unless we get these regulations in place against adulterated products. But right now we're seeing a fairly dramatic surge in consumer demand for Kratom products.
Thank you. Representative Resnick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is Kratom currently being sold in Kansas?
I can answer
Yes,
that.
it is. Yeah.
We passed a bill several years ago that legalized it. This bill just attempts to regulate it, because presently it's unregulated. With that, I'm going to go to our next proponent, Representative Nick Rediker. Are you on the line?
Mr. Chairman?
Yes. Are you there?
I am here, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me okay?
You can. Go right ahead. Because of our time restraints, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, for allowing me to speak today. My name is Nick Reinecker. I'm a proponent to this bill on the belief that a set of rudimentary regulation is often needed to provide a layer of consumer protection. However, I believe there is a difference between healthy regulation and bloated overreach that for this appears at face value to unduly broaden the scope of authority to involve state entities, and in the end hinders the freedom of Kansas citizens to produce, buy, and sell, and or possess and cultivate a natural occurring substance, presenting undue burden. I also think of the precedent being set, calling food with mitragena in it a Kratom product, whereas when we look at the definitions of food and drugs and everything, they are kind of a mess if I had my opinion. I'm also an opponent in the hopes that this will be a catalyst to the cleaning up of the Kansas Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and making it more equitable and consistent. So it appears that would mitigate what appears to be arbitrary and capricious use of definitions and the placement of natural and synthetic substances, articles, components, and isolated alkaloids in different categories. When somebody eats a plant, whether it be spinach or mitragena, it has certain vitamin and minerals in it, and it also affects the structure, may in fact affect the FOSB, delta FOSB expression and everything. So, the definitions. So when I look at my wife and I run a restaurant here in the middle of Kansas, and if I serve a plate of mitragena leaves with a side of mitragena infused salad dressing consisting of caffeine infused cola, soybean oil, and monosodium glutamate, does that salad have to be labeled? Do I have to check the ID of the customer ordering it? And can I grow metragena myself at home in my garden and use it personally and give it to children? Looking at the, you have my testimony here, and I would just implore you to look over it and see how things are kind of set up, and maybe some situations that you as a legislature can kind of streamline it, make it more appropriate, and then when you're dealing with other issues, kind of make it consistent and equitable for the Kansas citizen. I don't really have anything more beyond ranting and raving, so I'll thank you for your time and stand for any questions.
Thank you, committee. Are there any questions? Seeing none, we will go ahead and move over to our opponents. We have Mr. Titus from the Kansas Department of Agriculture. Welcome to committee.
Thank you, representatives, members of the committee. My name is Kenny Titus. I'm Chief Counsel for the Kansas Department of Agriculture, and we're here in opposition to House Bill 2056 today. I would like to start out and thank the proponents of this bill. After it was introduced last year, as you correctly recalled, we were in opposition. Much of our opposition last year, not all of it, but much of it, was based on the lack of an actual licensing structure that we could enforce and actually pay for the inspections that were required. The proponents of the bill did work with us, and we believe that the licensing structure that's put in place in this bill in and of itself can be carried out by our department. It models most of our other regulatory and licensure programs. So on that count, we don't have any objections to the bill going forward. However, the Kansas Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act is modeled after the federal version of that statute. As proponents have even highlighted, there is strong FDA testimony warning against the human consumption of Kratom, and that's the guidance we rely on. We're not conducting scientific studies or extensive research on this. We rely on the FDA when we make these decisions under enforcing things in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and with such strong FDA resistance to the impacts of Kratom. Our primary concern is if we issue licenses to people that are selling Kratom, it will give the impression that the state is saying it's safe to consume this, and it could be bought in a commercial, non-regulated setting like a quick shop or something like that. And we're just concerned that the minimum testing required wouldn't actually allow us to reinforce that image that might be out there that this is a safe product to consume, barring the FDA changing their position. So the other thing that came up was we did not consider cutting Kratom with illegal drugs when we considered testing, and we use our agriculture lab for that. We're not really set up to be testing for anything more than the basic compounds that are outlined in the bill. So that's something that we've not had an in-depth conversation with law enforcement about how that might play out. So overall, we can deal with the licensing piece of it, but we just have overarching concerns with the FDA position, and we thought it was important that at least be expressed on the record.
Thank you, committee. Are there any questions? Representative Epley.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair, and thank you for your testimony today, Mr. Titus. I did just want to clarify with you that because this has already been sold in our state that I know of for sure for 3 years already and not regulated, I would think that I'd like to hear your thoughts on whether this is better off being regulated, at least by our Department of Ag, than no regulation as is the current situation.
Sure, I understand that concern. We don't necessarily have a position on that. Our concern is just that a stamp of approval from our department doesn't necessarily add much to the consumer safety.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Vice Chair, and welcome back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Representative Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Titus, I have a question. If the KDA has a way that they would be able to test for salmonella, given that over 130 cases up until April of 2018 of salmonella and kratom have been identified and 38 deaths. Do we have a way to test for that?
We do. In testing the kratom compounds, there's an additional test we run that I'm told is similar to how we test in our animal feed in the lab. So that would be part of the testing when we inspect a product. Our plan would be to routinely test for salmonella when we do draw a product.
Thank you.
Thank you. Further questions? Department of Ag, yes.
Second time, Mr. Chair, and thank you. Just briefly, and I don't know the sheer numbers, but will you have the capacity to take this on regulatory-wise, as to your knowledge, or will it be an undue burden on the Department of Ag? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Representative Howe, you have a question?
Yeah, yes, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. To answer your question about the capacity, we believe we handle this. So under the Food, Drug, Cosmetic Act, we would use our restaurant inspectors or food establishment and food processing inspectors. It would the licensing fee would cover any additional cost that we would do in rule and regulation. But many of those, we assume there would be some overlap in premises.
Thank you. Representative Howe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Titus, in the fiscal note on this bill, it says the testing would be performed every 3 years for each licensee. Any fiscal effect associated with HB 2056 is not obviously reflected in the governor's report, but is the testing sufficient being performed every 3 years? Is the Department of Agriculture feel that's an acceptable level of testing?
The chairman would allow one of our program staff on WebEx that might be better to answer that question.
Is that available?
They should be Mr. Inman or Mr. Morris. I think Mr. Inman
Good morning.
stepped off. Yeah, okay.
Good morning.
Before to get, if you'll state your first, last name, and who you are with.
Hello, my name is Adam Inman, and I'm the Assistant Program Manager for Food Safety and Lodging at the Kansas Department of Agriculture.
Did you get the
And
question?
yes, we designed the scheme for a routine surveillance sampling scheme. So we would collect samples for cause if there were reason to believe that the products were adulterated or otherwise unfit, so that once every 3 years is a routine surveillance scheme that would provide ongoing, just general surveillance to see what the landscape is on these products and their quality.
Thank you. Representative Howe, follow up?
Yes. In the fiscal note, I don't believe it makes a distinction in how much administrative cost this would be for the Department of Agriculture. Are there any numbers that you have analyzed that can let us know how much taxpayer money would be needed to stand up the administration of this?
Our analysis indicated that we'd be able to bear those costs as the licensing fees came in and as the program developed.
We would base it on the fee collection. We anticipate that there would be enough licensees to support the inspections.
So it would cost the state nothing.
I believe that's right, yeah.
Thank you. Representative Wagner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Titus, you made reference to the FDA has concerns over Kratom, and I've seen that alluded to. What particularly are their concerns, and is there like a published copy of the FDA concerns?
There is. In my testimony, I put a footnote that the first link in that does go straight to the FDA's warning. If you Google FDA and Kratom, you'll get a list of their warning letters. But they primarily identified that it has these opioid-like impacts on people, along with it, some of the salmonella, and they've investigated a number of incidences that the proponents did speak about. So,
thank you. I have no other questions. Thank you for coming here today and appearing in person. Thank you. Folks, I have no other opponents listed. Anyone in the audience that wish to appear and offer testimony? Seeing none, then I will close the hearing on House Bill 2056. Committee, just to give you a little heads up, we will be working Thursday. I may send out a new agenda, but for the following week, and you'll get a new agenda for this, we'll have a number of bills that we want to hear. On the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of February, bills that you've previously heard may be worked on Thursday. This Thursday. Representative Clayton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just have a question. Because we are working in these uncertain times where we're not running the way that we normally would, in the past, when we had amendments prepared, the revisers would bring those paper copies. Could we be notified at least the night before which bills we're working so that we could have those copies in hand? Just if we communicate better, then we'll all be able to do everything that's needed since we're doing things differently this year.
I can do that, notify you the night before. The reviser will tell you that they will, if you have an amendment, that they will encourage you to get your copies, the paper copies, to bring to committee members.
All right, and
they will have their,
should we just, anytime we have an amendment written, just make sure we are always carrying those with us, since we don't know which days we'll be working bills?
Well, I told you that we'd give you the night before notice.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate that.
That's all right. But then again, circumstances change day by day. And if you'll notice the agenda, it says on days, any bill previously heard. So I would suggest after a hearing, if you have amendments, to get with the reviser. So let's go back. Bill introductions. From committee. Seeing no bill introductions from committee, bill introductions from the audience. Again, I see no bill introductions. Tomorrow we have 3 bills. We will start with the first 2 bills that the AG has introduced and see how long that takes. I'd like to get all 3 of them in, but there's no guarantee. Anything else for the good of the committee? And Representative Carpenter, you sent me an email, and yes, you can. With that,